Welcome to the return of the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 216.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers who are looking to shoot lower scores. Dedicated to professional club fitting, putting and short game improvement, and effective practice techniques to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to sharing useful information on professional club fitting, putting and short game improvement, and effective practice techniques, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time. I'm very excited to be back with all of you, doing a podcast interview about a fascinating new book. In 2019, I did an interview with Scott Young, best-selling author of a book titled Ultra Learning. Well, a few months ago, Scott emailed me to ask if I'd be interested in doing a new interview with him about his just-published book, Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. I said, absolutely, I'd be interested. I was one of the first to pre-order the book that came out on May 7. And here we are, bringing you a great interview about Scott's new book.
Tony Wright and Game Improvement Golf, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time.
Welcome to episode 216 of the return of the Golf Improvement Podcast. I'm delighted to welcome back Scott Young, who's a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of Ultra Learning, and he and I did an interview together back 2019. Well, he had to have been very busy writing his new book, Getting Back to Anything, and that is going to be another bestseller. And thank you for asking me to interview about this. And it's nothing about the book, but I might not have found it, and it's a very valuable read. So thanks, Scott, and welcome today.
Oh yeah, thank you. It's great to be back here.
Yeah. So in Get Better at Anything, you said there were two things that sparked you to write this book. Share a little bit about those two things, and maybe just a little bit about your overall process for creating this book.
Yeah. So whenever you write a book, you kind of choose an idea, a frame that gives you a point of view, and that lets you talk about some things and not others. So with the first book, Ultra Learning, the central focus was on people who did these sort of intensive self-directed learning projects. And so the first story that kind of popped out after that, which was like, this wasn't a story that fit in the last book, but I really liked it and I thought it illustrated something really important and profound, was the story of Tetris. So Tetris is a game. It's been around for about 3 decades, a little bit more, closer to 4 decades. And when people were playing it in the late 80s, early 90s, they were obsessed with it. There was like op-eds written about how people are hallucinating falling blocks. So there certainly wasn't a dearth of practice. Like people were really playing this game obsessively. But if you look at their high scores by the leaderboards of like people who track the best players in the world, they just weren't actually that good. They weren't that good. And there are kids now who are like 12, 13-year-olds who are much, much better at the game than these people were, decades ago. And the question is why? And the reason why is that people today have a much better ability to learn how to play Tetris and improve at Tetris because they can learn better from other people.
Yeah.
So in the old days, you maybe learned a few tips from one of your brother's older friends or something like that, and you would gain some idea of how the game worked. But there might be process in the game, strategies, techniques, tactics that would just be invisible to you, even if you spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours practicing. In contrast, kids today, they can look online, and there is really detailed discussions and demonstrations, and you can watch videos of people. It turns out that there's like certain specific ways you need to hold the controller to use certain techniques, and that's very important for playing really highly. And so this was, I thought, a very interesting kind of story, because it wasn't about one particular Tetris player who just happened to be really good, but it was about how if you change the environment, or if you change the ingredients that go into learning, you can have not just better learning for an individual, but for an entire field. And so this turned out to have big implications, and it shows up in lots of places. And so that kind of became the starting point of writing this book, of Get Better at Anything, of looking at sort of what are these fundamental ingredients that drive improvement or impede it in some cases.
And then there was another thing you said that was kind of a driver, right? And I didn't write down what the second one was. I think you mentioned it near the end of the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it was, so this is a little bit more of a technical point, but part of it was I'd started doing a lot of research on transfer of learning. So transfer is this idea that if you practice one skill, how much will it help you learn other skills? And so we all understand transfer intuitively. I mean, if I learn to play racquetball and then I go to play tennis after, there's some transfer between those skills because they're kind of similar in some ways. And so this is a really fascinating area. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting and I encountered this research when I was doing ultra learning, is that a lot of the studies that have looked into transfer, where you train someone in one thing and then you get them to practice something else, find that there's a lot less transfer than people often think. So people often have this idea that if you learn to do computer programming, you're going to be a better logical thinker, or if you learn chess, it's going to help you with business strategy. And those things turn out to not be true. And I had been, originally my idea was, I was thinking, oh, well, this sort of suggests that you should spend a lot of time practicing exactly the thing they should practice, because what's going to have the best transfer but the thing that you're trying to get good at. Now, it turns out, as you dig into the research, that there's a lot of complications behind this. And so part of writing this book was also to see, when that's true and when that's not true. So the end product of the book, I think, took a different form than I was anticipating. But that was sort of the starting point, at least from the scientific research.
Yeah. Now, the core of the entire book is what you call the 3 factors of determining. But then when I wrote this down, and I thought, you said how much, and much seemed to be more interesting in many ways than I originally thought, because it's not just how we learn, but how much we learn. So that see, do, and feedback. Share why these have kind of formed the core of your book.
Yeah, so the 3 basic ingredients are seeing. Most of what we learn comes from other people. So the ability to see examples from other people, to see the problem-solving processes they use, to be able to learn from their examples is huge in being able to learn. And it explains the Tetris story, because the issue wasn't practice. The issue wasn't really feedback. Like, people were able to do practice before. They were able to play the game for hundreds of hours. They were able to see what their score were. They were getting feedback. The difference, I believe, was that the people today have just a much larger and more detailed library of techniques they can pursue. So when they start practicing, they're already learning much better methods than people were decades ago. So C is the first component. It's very important. The second one is do. Obviously, to get good at any skill, you need to do a lot of practice. But one of the things I thought was really interesting from reading the research is that it's not the case that just doing something a lot necessarily makes you better at it. I'm sure with the Golf Improvement Podcast, you've seen lots of people over the years who have been golfing for decades, and they don't seem to be getting that much better. And so part of what was interesting for me looking at the research is, what is it exactly that practice is doing? What kind of practice is important for improvement? And we often get this wrong. There's lots of studies showing that people systematically make mistakes when choosing what kind of activities to do for learning. They choose things that don't actually optimize how quickly they'll learn things. And then the final element is feedback. We need to have corrective information, not just from a teacher, not just from a good coach, but from the environment itself. Like, you'd never be able to learn to golf if I just gave you a Wii remote and you just did Wii golf your whole time. You're never going to learn, because the actual movements, the actual details of the environment really matter, and they feed into that. And so that's also a really important accelerant and limit on growth when you're learning skills.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes golf kind of really a toughie, for a lot of people, is taking it in the environment for sure. Um,
Yeah.
you know, there were two or three things that really, really fascinated me about the book, but one of them is sort of a thing that, I've been involved. For example, I used to do reading at an elementary school with young
Mm-hmm.
kids, and so many things that are going on about, kids are struggling about
Mm-hmm.
reading as many
Yeah.
as they need to do. And so you talked about two learning approaches that seemed a little bit different: master learning and direct instruction.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about these, but also the correct blend of success and failure is really
Right.
important. And I didn't think you were going to say that.
So there's sort of three ideas there. So I'm gonna take them one at a time. So the first one, you're talking about reading instruction, and I thought reading instruction is fascinating because it's one of the areas where there's just been an enormous amount of investment in scientific studies on what's the best way to teach reading, what's the best way to get kids to learn to read. I mean, if you compare it to, let's say, golf, I mean, there's quite a few studies on golf too. I don't want to say golf is understudied, but there's a lot more on reading, and there's
Oh,
a lot
yeah.
more on reading than like learning to do watercolor painting or something like that, right? And so it's sort of a stand-in for a lot of other skills because we have just this enormous amount of educational research that's been done on it. And the basic finding from reading research is that phonics, systematic phonics, where you basically break down the reading activity into, okay, we got to learn the letters, got to learn the sounds the letters make. We got to blend the sounds of the letters together. We got to practice reading short words and then bigger words. And you got to practice on reading texts that use the sound spelling combinations that you've learned. Like this sort of very systematic approach is more effective than some of the other approaches, which I think until very recently were dominant in most educational systems, which were, you know what, we're going to get kids to just memorize what certain words look like because they have kind of irregular spelling, and we're just going to teach them this love of reading and they'll figure it out on their own. And I mean, that works for some students, but it doesn't work for all the students. And the research clearly favors the first approach, which I think is a universal property of learning, that the more you can break something down into components that are each individually learnable, you can practice them and build them up, you're going to be more successful, which ties into the second point. This is basically what direct instruction does, is that it takes a skill or a subject that you wish to teach and you break it down into these very atomic components. So, being able to recognize the letter D would be one of the components of learning to read. And then you get practice on that and then you build into a more complicated task. And direct instruction is kind of funny because on the one hand, it's sort of a stand-in. Like people use the word direct instruction to mean like whatever traditional picture they have of teaching in their head. But in fact, like if you look at the theory of direct instruction, I mean, I've had years of classes and I've never taken a class that's been taught this way. These cycles of seeing an example, getting practice, getting feedback, and they're very quick. So you're going back and forth. It's not sit in and listen to a lecture for an hour and then do a test. It's very quick cycles of feedback is a really good way to learn skills, particularly skills that have these kind of building blocks where you have to build up. And mastery learning is sort of a related technique, but it's not so prescriptive about exactly how you do the teaching. The basic idea of mastery learning is, again, you teach a lesson, you get people to do an interim test, so not a test that's for grade, not something that you are going to be getting punished for if you don't do very well on. You identify the students that are not doing that well, and if they're not getting the material, you give them different instruction, let them do it again. And these cycles of teach, get them to do some sort of exercise and get feedback are also central to that process. And both mastery learning and direct instruction are shown to be effective in these sort of comprehensive studies. And so I think they sort of illustrate, again, the broader theme of my book, that you need to have these three ingredients. And so teaching philosophies that tend to align with that have seeing, doing, and feedback, and they integrate these into nice practice loops, tend to do better than ones where one of these components is sort of conspicuously missing. And so the third point you made was about success and failure. I don't know whether you want me to jump in with that or
Oh, yeah. I think,
sure.
and that's as
I've been
important
talking for
as
a while.
anything. Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, go ahead.
So this was also an idea that I thought was interesting because I think, especially if you read anything in the self-improvement space, anything in this kind of like popular nonfiction business book genre, you've heard a lesson over and over again, which is that like we need to be facing failures and challenges, and it builds our grit and determination. And like nothing's worse than just, making it too easy on people, and then they're never going to develop real character, right? Like this is something that I feel weird even saying out loud because it's so obvious to most people that they don't even say it. And the interesting thing from going through a lot of research is that I don't think there's a good justification for that. That in most cases, for most skills, being able to build on a foundation of success is not only going to be better for learning the skill. So if we're talking about learning to read, for instance, having these successful building blocks before you move on to more complicated tasks is going to increase the efficiency of learning. Not just about, making it easier for you so you can learn, but it's going to increase the efficiency. So if you give people a text which uses the sort of like phonetic rules that they've already learned, they're going to learn more from that text than if you use one that doesn't use them, which is, I think, somewhat surprising. And so this is sort of an intellectual principle that you want to build from the right foundation, get the right building blocks. There's definitely such a thing as like trying to get people to do things that are too hard and they're not going to be able to grasp the right approach. And then second of all, for motivation, it is true that once you have this sort of foundation of motivation, facing challenges and succeeding through them are important. But in the beginning, when you don't have any experience in a domain, if you experience a lot of early failures, that can be quite devastating for motivation. Yeah. So I think this is something that's very important for teachers because I think just implicitly, and I've met teachers that are like this, that they have this kind of like, trial by fire sort of teaching approach and they pride themselves on it. And I mean, yeah, if the goal is to weed out students and to get, to have a lot of students not continue with the class and give up, and then you only have to deal with the brightest and most talented, then yeah, that's a good approach. But if we want people to succeed broadly, then creating conditions where you can have success and you can build on it are super important.
I hope, the world sort of figures out how to get this right more than they do right now, Now, the next one, I know so many people, friends, that have done the brain training stuff, right? And when I read what you said there, that brain training doesn't work, I thought, am I going to get in trouble, right? I'll just keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
But you quote statistics about it, but it's also connected, to muscle, the concept of muscle memory, right?
Yeah.
And
sorry, keep
crazy. Going. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, when people say muscle memory, I think the typical idea of muscle memory is just sort of a misconception. It's just the idea that like motor skills, like, hitting a golf swing or this kind of thing, that they're somehow stored in the muscles. And while there is probably some amount of the nervous system is stored in the muscles, like there's a certain amount that the nerve endings plate onto the muscles that it affects firing rates and stuff. Basically, all skills are actually stored in your brain. There's like a little bit in the spinal cord, but basically any kind of sophisticated skill you're performing is in the brain. So muscle memory is just memory. It's just a different kind of memory. It's not in your muscles. But the different kind of metaphor, the one that I spend a lot of time attacking in this chapter, is the idea that the mind is like a muscle, that if you train it in some sort of generic way, that it will get broad abilities that transfer to lots of different areas. And this is sort of going back to this transfer research that I started with, that there's a lot of research on this. It's not very well known, I think, or well appreciated, but that shows that if you train people in a specific skill, what they tend to know is that specific skill. Sometimes if that skill is like analogous to something else, you'll get some benefit, but often it's not the case that you're going to do that. And so brain training is the clearest example of this metaphor in action, because brain training really relies on this idea that the brain is like a muscle, and you, just like you should go to the gym and exercise, then it stands to reason you should go to some kind of mental gym and do some sort of mental exercise. And while I do, I'm a big advocate of learning and education, and I think it's very important to engage in mental activity, it's simply not the case that doing Sudoku puzzles will just make you a more acute reasoner in general. That's just not how the brain works. And so there's been a lot of interest in this possibility that maybe the brain works like a muscle in some way. And they've done lots of very extensive studies with many, many participants. I mean, one of the studies I cite had something like 11,000 participants. So we're not talking about like, these N=3 studies that are mostly anecdotal. These are really powerful studies. And again, it's very difficult to find these effects, that you mostly get these sort of short-term training effects that apply to fairly similar skills. So if you practice a lot with Sudoku, you might get better at like similar puzzles that require some of the same principles as Sudoku, but you're almost certainly not going to be getting better at like reading Shakespeare or swinging a golf club or something like this. And so I think this has been something that's been really oversold, and I think it gives the wrong impression about how learning works for people.
And I'll bet you're taking a little heat for putting that in the book. Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, people don't like it. I haven't heard that many people really strenuously like argue against me on that one, because I feel like if you read the evidence, it is pretty clear. I have had like every once in a while, I when I first wrote about this on my website, I wrote an article where I was like very specifically calling out brain training, and sometimes people are like, I disagree or this kind of thing. But the ones that I like are the people who are like, well, yes, that's true of this, but there's this one kind of brain training that works this way. And, there's some, if you're very careful about how you measure it, it creates an effect or this kind of thing. And I mean, that's how science works. It's always possible. It's always possible that like we just haven't found the right kind of brain training yet. But my opinion is that this metaphor that the mind is like a muscle and that it trains in this way, this is not new. This has been for like over a century. This idea has floated around, and basically every time it's rigorously tested, there's problems with it. And so I think the most that we can probably hope for when we're doing this kind of training is that when you learn something, that maybe it's analogous to something else. So I was saying like the racquetball squash or racquetball tennis example. I mean, a lot of the movements of forehand shot, a backhand shot are just fairly similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're fairly similar. So it would be the case that if you learn one racket sport, you would learn the other one faster. And so similarly, like if you are a math PhD and then you go into finance on Wall Street, well, a lot of the math is the same. So you're going to learn it a lot faster too.
Right.
So my model for the way you should be thinking about mental improvement, which I think more closely aligns with how the mind works, is that the mind is a collection of tools. And so if you want to have broad skills, you have to read broadly. Like it's just like if you want to speak a language, you have to know a lot of words. There's not like one word you can keep repeating to yourself and then all of a sudden you speak French. You need to know all of them. And so that's kind of the idea, that if you want to have breadth, if you want to have range in your abilities, then you actually have to learn a lot of different things.
So you talk about 3 phases of learning: cognitive, associative, and autonomous. And you also have a chapter in the book about Tiger's swing changes.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to me. It hit me there. Yeah, he did that. And he's amazing for the ability to do that. But boy, most of us don't have the background skill set to make that kind of thing turn around. Talk a little bit about that whole arena.
I mean, the Tiger story, I think the Tiger story is like, I like it more of a story than as, it's always nice when you have a story that like really cleanly illustrates, well, and therefore this. But I think Tiger's story in some ways is better because this idea of, for lack of a better word, I'll call it unlearning, but like when you have to learn a new skill that actively competes with an old skill. So in Tiger's case, he went through, somewhat notoriously, through a number of swing coaches who made fairly dramatic changes to how he was swinging a golf club off the drive. And I mean, Tiger is the kind of person who has enough talent and work ethic to push through it. But as I document there's a lot of controversy over those decisions simply because they cost him time when he was at his sort of athletic prime. Maybe that's the reason he's not going to get Nicklaus's record. But at the same time, it also is something that many other players have tried and failed at. So they tried to make major swing changes as they moved up to a new tier of competition, and the result was failure. And so I think this shows a couple interesting things. So one thing it shows is the importance of getting sort of in the right ballpark of the skill to begin with. Now, I don't think there's such a thing as like you, for instance, like I'm not a great golfer, so I should be asking you for advice, but I don't think you could take me down to the course and be like, okay, you're going to like move this muscle this much and move that muscle this much and make this swing. And like, you could create the perfect swing for me. No, all you can do is make suggestions. All you can do is like kind of guide me, tell me what to think about, tell me, okay, you need to like imagine yourself doing this. Like that's all you can really do to sculpt how I'm going to swing. And it's not going to start out perfect. But if I just go to the golf course by myself, for instance, and I'm doing something that's like really not the right way to do it, and then I get tons and tons of practice, what this shows is that, the risk of this is that you can really ingrain in a sort of inefficient way to do things. And, my favorite example to use, I find I return to this when I have these podcast discussions, is typing on a keyboard, because a lot of people, they'll learn, maybe without a teacher, they'll learn to do sort of hunting and pecking with 2 fingers or a couple fingers, and they look at the keyboard and they type it back and forth. And it's pretty clear that this is not an efficient way to type compared to touch typing, where you have, all of your fingers on the home row, thumbs below, and you like, when I type the Q key, I always use my pinky finger. Like that's the correct way you do the typing. And the thing is that if you do lots and lots of practice with this hunting and pecking, then not only is it not going to transform into touch typing in any way, so it's not like you're going to eventually become a touch typer if you just do enough practice, but also you're going to have such automaticity, such fluency with doing it, that it can be very difficult to avoid it. So I think it's much harder for someone to learn the proper typing rules and the typing skill if they've spent 30 years doing the previous one. So I'm interested in your thoughts here, because you actually spend a lot of time helping people improve their golf game.
I'm a coach for putting more than I have full swing, but I can only share my own personal story, right? A little bit lately, because I haven't been able to play. My friend in Germany has been giving me a set of tasks to do. Okay. Mm-hmm. And some of the beginning ones were pretty easy, like make a proper grip, make a couple of things about how you do wrist cock, and I do different things for 20 or 30 days. But I got to a task where I was hitting balls inside, which I do every day just for fun, right? Mm-hmm. And I really struggled with some parts because of what I had done in the past.
Yeah.
And it's taken me, I'm only in the last week or two seeing some, some obvious things where I kind of get it.
Yeah.
So for some people, it's easy to make changes, reasonably easy to make some changes, but boy, making a significant change to a golf swing, you better be doing it, I think, in a small piece by small piece way.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think this sort of feature of how we learn things says a lot about this sort of, again, what we talked about here, the 3 phases of skill learning. This was Fitz and Posner. They published this book called Human Performance, where they sort of, based on studies, they sort of suggested this model of how performance works. And this has gone on to be like one of those citation classics. Like this is a thing that everyone points to. And they argue that skill learning tends to come in 3 phases. So the first phase is what they call the cognitive phase. And this is where a lot of your thinking about the skill is explicit. So if you were to, advise me, if you're putting, okay, hold it this way, move your hand this way, and, think about this when you're hitting it. So it's very explicit. It's very conscious when you're doing it. And when you're performing the skill, you're thinking about those instructions, you're thinking about the rules. And as you practice more and more and more, that explicit instruction part becomes less relevant to the skill. You just do it. And then we get to the associative phase. And the associative phase is where you are practicing the skill in different environments, different situations. And it's less about trying to get the broad movement, but about fine-tuning it. So you're tweaking it. So like, I need this much force to putt the ball, this many meters and on this kind of grass and this kind of, you're getting those little variables, and through practice, you're fine tuning them at a sort of almost an unconscious level. And then finally, you get to the autonomous phase. And the autonomous phase is when continued practice isn't necessarily making you much better at the skill, because you've already fine-tuned it in the associative phase. You are, you've got to hit the point of diminishing returns for performance improvements. But what you're getting better at is making it more and more automatic. So it requires less and less effort, less and less conscious awareness in order to perform the skill. And so when we think about our daily lives, what we want is a lot of skills in the autonomous phase. So to go back to our earlier example of reading, you don't want to be thinking about, well, how do which letter is this when you're trying to read the page. You want to just have the text be like a voice in your head, and then you can just think about what it means. And so you need to have this skill really fluently overlearned in order to be able to read properly, because if you have to be thinking about, sounding out individual words, well, you're done. You're not going to be able to actually think about the meaning. You're using up all of your mental bandwidth doing that task. But there's a downside to this, because once a skill is in the autonomous phase, it's not as available to conscious introspection. It's not as obvious to us how we're actually performing the skill. And because of that, making modifications to the skill, doing one thing instead of another, can be very difficult. And so that is the problem that experienced golfers like Tiger faced, is that you essentially have to build a competing skill, a competing way of doing it, and get enough repetition, enough practice so that it can actually outcompete the thing that you've been doing for maybe years, which, as you mentioned, it can be very hard to do that. So that is a good reason, again, to try to get in the ballpark of the right skill in the first place, but then to recognize, well, when you do need to make a transition, if you do need to, if you want to improve and you aren't doing it the right way, you're going to have to do some of that work. So there's lots of good examples of that. But I thought Tiger's case really nicely epitomized both the sort of the hope and the danger of doing some kind of major rebuilding efforts.
I think those are really good words for that. The hope, but also the danger. Yeah, that's a good way to kind of summarize this part. So now I was really surprised that you had a discussion about anxiety and its role in learning and mastery. But, once you say that, it does make sense. Anxiety is like such a big problem in our world. And how it connects with learning. But, before I let you talk about that, I want to share something that happened the last week with me, though. And that was related to my little golf stuff, right, that I'm doing and making changes. I had 2 instances where I was so frustrated, I wanted to just throw my hands up. And the next day, in each of those cases, I figured out something. And I connected those two. Now, maybe that's not going to be the way I learn all the time, to get so frustrated that I go crazy, but it sort of happened. I let myself get through that. So maybe in some cases, being frustrated and depressed or whatever can lead you to the next step. Okay.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Right.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really clear to me when I was writing Ultra Learning is that the way most people think about learning is on an emotional level. So, we can talk about memory and skill curves and all this kind of somewhat intellectualizing way of doing it. But the firsthand subjective experience people have with any skill is feelings like frustration, boredom, pride, and indeed anxiety, indeed stress and fear. And so I think that in my mind, I think that a lot of these things are linked. So if you have a better understanding, you have kind of an intellectual understanding of what are some of the root causes of those emotions as well. So, I mean, frustration can happen for lots of reasons, but I tend to think of it as primarily occurring when you are trying to find a solution to a problem, but you're not able to. And so the emotion of frustration is kind of partly your brain saying, oh, you're not going to find it. You're like, this is a dead end, what you're doing right now. And I mean, you're right. Sometimes when we get into a difficult problem, we have to push through frustration, because you really do need to try a few different things. You need to have a few different things before stuff will actually click and solidify. And so patience through frustration is often a virtue. But the reason we get frustrated at all, the reason that, we don't just love doing something, hundreds of times and not getting any results, is because, for certain types of problems, for certain types of problem spaces, if we don't have good strategies or methods, the possibilities that we might have to go through to be able to find something that works are just enormous. And so it's partly kind of an evolved adaptation that's just telling your brain, okay, you know what, better to just stop right here. And so anxiety is a similar thing. It's a very basic emotional response that has a very adaptive behavior that when you encounter threats, things that might be a danger to you, not only physically, but also socially. We're a social species. And if you do something that's going to cause you great embarrassment or humiliation, those were also dangers in a time period before when, you could be ostracized or exiled from the tribe. So we have these sort of hardwired feelings about certain types of things we have fear. And so I think the understanding the mechanisms of how anxiety functions, how it relates to learning, I think are super important because, I've had so many conversations with people and they just tell me like, oh yeah, no, I understand, the spacing rule, or I understand this thing about learning, but, I just get this like knots in my stomach whenever I think about actually doing any practice. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's a much bigger and more fundamental problem than, what kind of flashcard to use or something like that.
Yeah. Well, we're going to put a plug in for another book, by the way, right here. I don't know if you've heard of Brett McCabe's book, Kick Anxiety's Ass, but
oh, nice. Yeah.
It's a phenomenal book about, what people really should understand about anxiety. And, but you said it, you have to accept that potential that you'll get anxious about something rather than fighting it,
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting from the research, especially because it's a kind of learning, it fits in with the themes of the book, is that people who are particularly anxious about something tend to get less anxious the more exposure they have to it. Now, some of that is just like if you're already anxious about something, then you're probably overestimating the threat of it. And if you experience it, you're going to naturally go back. But I think it's even deeper than that, that even things that are, genuinely dangerous, genuinely terrifying, that like they have some, like maybe you should be afraid of that. It seems to be the case that continued exposure often results in reduced response. So the example that I use in the opening story is this sort of major misprediction by psychologists of how people would respond to bombings during the London Blitz, that everyone basically assumed that there would be mass panic and everyone would be fleeing to the subways and trampling each other to death and this kind of thing. And this basically didn't happen, that like people they didn't love it. I mean, I don't want to say that they had a positive response to things, but there wasn't the major episodes of mental distress. And you can think about that even in like how people responded to the coronavirus outbreak, that like when it first happened, there was extreme fear, like, people would be washing off their groceries and doing this kind of stuff. And now, I mean, there are still some people who are quite cautious, but the overall level of caution to, a virus that is still very much with us has gone down considerably. And it went down even before vaccines were really widespread as well. So I think it shows this basic mechanism that when you get exposure to a situation, particularly where something really really traumatic happening to you is actually not super likely. It's not going to happen in most of the cases. The normal response is adaptation. And that this is a useful thing to keep in mind when you're learning skills where you have fear or anxiety about them, that if you just do them enough, you're going to feel a lot better.
Yeah. This next one wasn't, I guess, anything that was specifically in your book, but it's, it's what I like to call the YouTube epidemic. There are so, and I fight this myself because I'm on some Facebook pages and somebody will post a swing and they'll say, can you give me advice about my golf swing?
Yeah.
And 50 people will respond. And I don't think, for the most part, people are getting help by that.
Yeah.
Because it's just so much. Maybe, I don't know if chatter is the right word, but you got to find a good coach. You got to find somebody that you can trust to do this stuff and be with them, I think, in general in golf.
Well, right? So you tell me, because I'm not a golf expert and I don't frequent golf YouTube as much, but do you think the problem of these people getting this advice is that the advice is bad, or that the advice is good, it's just not very useful, they need to have more than just the advice? I'm very curious what you think of, like, because I have my own thoughts about other domains, but within golf, do you find that like someone posts their swing, are the comments that are people giving advice usually like informed, or are they sort of like, well, this is a coin toss, some of these people are advocating you do something that's even worse?
I think there's a little bit of a coin toss. I'm sure some of the people that respond are good.
Yeah.
But then how do you pick?
Right. Okay. So
right?
now that I know your thoughts on that, I can weigh in on my own, because I have a similar thing. Because especially when you write a book where you have a whole section devoted to feedback, and I've written before about like the importance of getting feedback and stuff. People, I think, sometimes make the mistake that either I believe or that I'm advocating for, that like, well, you need more feedback and that all feedback is good. and sometimes if the feedback is really noisy, it's worse than nothing. Like it doesn't help you at all, because you pay a
Yeah,
lot of attention to it as a signal. And if there's mostly noise, there's no signal there. There's a lot of situations where feedback is actually not helpful. And so I think there's definitely a lot of skills where if you have no feedback, and particularly if we're talking about feedback in the broader meaning of the term, so it's not just like a specific piece of verbalized advice given to you by someone else, but also to include, like, did the ball go near the hole? Like, that's also a kind of feedback that's very important. And in athletics, I think
sure,
it's
sure.
arguably more important than a lot of these other things. But what you were saying about that is definitely true. I mean, I think about like writing, and every once in a while, again, because I'm in this position where I advocate for feedback, you'll have readers who will say like, I think you should be doing this and this and this with whatever you're doing. And I don't want to say that it's not that it's universally not valuable, but I feel like people greatly overestimate their ability to give advice. And my general impression is that if someone who is is quite successful as an author, for instance, gives me feedback about like, what, this is what you're doing wrong, you need to do this and this, then I perk my ears up and listen, because they have a good idea, a good model of how the skill works, and they can maybe notice I'm making mistakes that I'm not doing. But for people who don't have any experience with the field or the profession and then say, oh, well, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that, those people are often wrong. They are often wrong, because
Yeah,
it is just
yeah,
simply not the case that just because you consume some kind of content, you have any idea about like what's a good way to make it. And that's true for me too. I mean, I can watch movies and I can say whether I liked a movie, I didn't like a movie, but I'm not about to go to Steven Spielberg and be like, well, you see what you need to do in Act 3. And this was
yeah.
a real problem there. And I mean, a lot of people like to armchair like that. So I will say this. Feedback in the general sense is very important. You want to be getting knowledge of what your results are, but getting the right kind of feedback is super important. And so for a physical skill like what we're talking about, having a good coach is really important, in part because of what we talked about, that like, maybe in theory, if you hit the golf club this way, it would be better than what you're naturally doing. But if I introduce instructions that bring you back to the cognitive phase of learning, that bring you back to where you are thinking about how your body's moving, you have this internal locus of attention, you can do a lot worse. So even if the idea is theoretically sound, it might just be pedagogically unsound. And then also, there's the additional problem that like, if you gather 50 different comments and 24 of them are bad, you don't average out and get like slightly good advice. You get
Right.
you get really wildly oscillating things. So I think having good coaches is very important, especially for athletic skills. And you see that it's a reason why having highly qualified coaches for various things, like they are coveted positions within athletics, because pretty much the field recognizes that, the guy who watches a lot of sports games on television is not qualified to be a good coach.
Yeah.
And that's true, I think, of many domains.
Well, that moves us into the next to the last question, by the way, because
Sure.
I know you have pushed this book to be a little bit for coaches too. And
Yeah.
so what are a couple things that you really want anybody who's a coach to take back from listening to this, and where they might get value from the book?
Yeah, I mean, I really like, there's a lot of different ideas that are covered in the book. So I really see it as being, if you were interested in a lot of the science of learning, but didn't want to read 100 academic textbooks, then this book could give you a good coverage of a lot of different ideas. So there's a lot of different threads you could go down. But the basic idea of seeing examples so people can learn through observation, getting practice, and then getting feedback is super important. And I think this is something that most coaches implement, but there are times where, and I think there's indeed lots of like pedagogical trends where people will sort of say, oh, well, you don't want to actually give people any examples. You want them to just sort of figure out things on their own, or you'll say things like, oh, you don't want to do too much practice or this kind of thing. I know that's a little bit less common in athletics, but certainly in some intellectual subjects, there's a real, like the word drill and kill is a phrase among teachers because there's sort of a little bit of an antagonism towards excessive practice. And so I think these basic ingredients are very important. And then it's about fine tuning them. It's about getting them in the right place. And I mean, what we just talked about like building from a successful foundation, like if I was going to get my kid to be good at an athletic skill, that would be what I'd want to do, is like, how can I take what starts off as a spark of interest and build it into a lot of motivation rather than, smother it prematurely by making it too hard or making it so that it's, he doesn't have the building blocks to succeed.
Yeah. I did another podcast with these, some people that have a process called Operation 36. And I think you would really like it.
Oh, interesting.
But what they do is they start kids out at 25 yards from the hole.
Yeah.
And they don't graduate until they get to, like a certain score for 9 holes, I think like 36. And they teach them different skills when they do it. And then they move to 50 yards and they move to 75 yards. And, so for a young kid, this is a phenomenal way to get to, to learn golf and improve and feel good about it.
Well, especially when you consider that, like, in the younger ages for golf, I mean, a major difficulty is like not being able to hit the ball far enough too, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that we often struggle with athletic skills, is that it's not this. It's like reading is the same whether you're an adult or a child. I mean, there's parts of your brain that change, but it's the same skill. But doing a lot of skills when you are 5 and when you are 50 are just different because you inhabit a different body. You're a different size. You have different strength, flexibility. All these kinds of variables are different. And so in some ways, when you're growing, when you're learning a skill, you're having to adjust things because things are different now than when you were learning them before.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you ended the book with these words, and I really loved them. But reaching for mastery and failing to grasp it is a good way to fail. For even when we can't become the best, we can still be a little better at things that matter the most to us. And a little better is often enough. And it made me think a lot, about, us mortal people, right? That just want to do things for fun, but we want to get better, right? And so talk a little bit about why you chose those words at the end.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I was driven by in writing this book, and I think it really expressed it well, is that whenever I would talk about, especially when you talk about people who are really great, so we mentioned Tiger Woods or anyone who has had just sort of tremendous accomplishment, it's often hard for people to even imagine themselves in that person's shoes, and they're very much going to fixate on the things that they can't do. They can't do like Tiger, like, oh, well, he was lobbing balls on the Mike Douglas show and he's 2-year-old. Like, how can I possibly do anything to approach that? And I think that this kind of, there's definitely something to learn from when we learn from these sort of larger than life examples. Sometimes they illustrate principles well. But at the end of the day, when we're making improvements to ourselves, we're always starting with where we are. And we're always trying to get a little bit bigger and a little bit better with the skills that we perform. And so, any journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So any lifelong attempt at mastery does start with just getting a bit better at the things that you're doing right now. And I think if you have that attitude, if you have the right mindset, I think that makes a big difference, because then you're focused on what you can change and what things you can improve. And I think that's the right attitude to have. And I think that's something that everyone can achieve, even if, there's certainly feats that we don't understand or can't replicate easily in ourselves that other people can do.
Yeah. But also, if you know some of the right ways to approach it, which is what the topic of your book is. So there you go, right?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing this with me today, Scott. It was great. I'll put a link in the show notes to your website where you've got a lot of other resources for people.
Yeah.
And,
I do.
And also to the book. I'm not even sure when we did this 5 years ago if you had a website, or at least I didn't remember.
Well, I did. I've had the website since 2006, so it definitely predates our call. But the website has been around for a while. And I mean, that's how I build up a lot of these ideas. So, I mean, the book, I cover a lot of stuff in the book, but at the same time, I have many books worth of essays on my website. So if people are interested in some of these topics, they can definitely dig deeper on there.
Tony Wright and Game Improvement Golf, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time.
Thanks, Scott, for the fascinating discussion about just a few of the interesting things that you share in Get Better at Anything. There were some very valuable learning surprises for me in your new book. I put a link in the show notes to where you can purchase Get Better at Anything, and also to Scott's website where you can find a lot of additional information sources related to his investigations on the science of learning. I realized the day I recorded this interview that I have really missed doing podcasts with interesting people. So while I don't plan to go back to an every other week schedule of posting interviews, I hope you'll all be pleased by the interviews I do post in the future. My shout out today is related to the way I recorded this new interview. Since I started podcasting in 2014, I've used a service called Libsyn to upload large audio files, like the ones that I record from the podcasts. Well, Libsyn's created something new called Libsyn Connect. I used it for the first time to record the interview with Scott, and it's amazing. The audio quality is excellent, and it's simple to use. Thanks, Libsyn and Libsyn Connect. Also related to Libsyn, they helped me to create a way to put my favorite previously published podcast audios into a YouTube channel. So if you click the link in the show notes for this, you can see all of these. I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube podcast channel and also like the episodes that you listen to. Thanks. Well, that's it for today. I promise that the Golf Improvement Podcast will be back with some new and interesting interviews very soon. Thanks to all of you loyal listeners. Take care. God bless Ukraine, and God bless America.
Game Improvement Golf, changing golfers' lives, one golfer at a time. www.gameimprovementgolf.com